What if I told you that the most important question you could ever ask is the one that no government, no authority, and no scientist has ever been willing to answer fully? What happens when you die? For centuries, human beings have stared into the mystery of death with both awe and terror. You've seen loved ones pass away. You've stood at funerals. And deep down, you've wondered whether their essence simply vanished, or whether something continued beyond the body's silence. It's the question whispered at night when everything goes quiet: is there life after death? In many places, people have the freedom to ask this question openly, to explore it through philosophy, religion, or personal experience. But imagine a society where even voicing such curiosity could be seen as dangerous. This was the case in the Soviet Union. Behind the iron walls of secrecy, there was no room for speculation about the afterlife. The state presented itself as the authority on truth, and that truth was firmly rooted in materialism. Life was biology, death was an ending. Anything more than that was superstition, weakness, or worse, counter to the state's control. You might wonder, why would such a simple, universal question be so threatening? What harm could it possibly do to ask whether there is something beyond the grave? The danger was not in the question itself, but in its implications. If life continues after death, then human beings are more than physical matter. If the soul survives, then no government can claim absolute power over you. If consciousness lives on, then you are not just a worker, not just a cog in a machine, not just a body to be used and discarded. You are eternal. And that idea terrifies those who thrive on control. The Soviet system, like many powerful systems before it, depended on its citizens believing only in what could be measured, counted, and confined. To control a population, it is easier to reduce them to biology, to deny the invisible parts of human experience. Faith, spirituality, and the exploration of life after death were obstacles to the total worldview that materialism imposed. So, the question of what lies beyond was not only ignored, it was silenced. And yet, even in the most controlled environments, truth finds cracks to seep through. Scientists themselves could not fully ignore the testimonies that emerged from hospitals. Stories of people clinically dead who returned with visions, voices, and experiences that could not be explained away by biology alone. They spoke of tunnels filled with light, of loved ones waiting, of overwhelming peace. Some whispered of darker visions, realms so terrifying they hesitated to share them. For the official Soviet narrative, these stories were dangerous because they suggested there was more to human life than flesh and bone. Think about it. If even one of those stories were true, if even one soul had glimpsed the continuation of existence beyond the body, then the entire foundation of a strictly materialist worldview would crumble. To acknowledge life after death would be to admit that human beings are spiritual beings, not merely physical ones. And with that admission would come a new kind of power, the kind that governments cannot regulate. For if you know you are eternal, if you know your consciousness cannot be destroyed, then you cannot be fully controlled by fear. This is why the question of life after death has always been both the most forbidden and the most liberating. It's forbidden because it threatens every institution that depends on obedience. It's liberating because it reveals to you a truth that makes you greater than any system. When the Soviet Union locked away testimonies, classified research, and silenced those who dared to ask, they weren't just protecting science from superstition, they were protecting control from collapse. Now pause for a moment and imagine yourself in that world. You live in a society that tells you life ends with death, that there is nothing more than the physical. You're expected to accept that as fact. But then someone you know dies and is revived, and they tell you they saw a great light. They felt peace beyond words. They spoke with someone long gone. Would you believe them? Would you risk repeating it to others, knowing that even curiosity could be branded as subversive? Or would you stay silent, suppressing the most important truth of your life, out of fear? This is why the archives of the Soviet Union held secrets that, if revealed, could have changed everything. Hidden testimonies, experiments conducted in secret, whispers from the edge of death itself. The question of whether life continues after death was never just about philosophy. It was about power. To admit the soul exists is to admit that no authority has the final word. And for regimes built on fear, nothing could be more dangerous than a human being who knows they are eternal. But here is the part that reaches directly into your own life. You've been taught, just like they were, to doubt what cannot be measured. Maybe you've brushed off those inner whispers. Maybe you've told yourself not to think too much about what happens after death, because it's too frightening, too uncertain. And yet, no matter how much you avoid it, the question follows you. Every time you look at a grave, every time you hear of someone passing, every time you feel the silence of a night where sleep feels like surrender, the question returns. You can feel it now, can't you? That tug inside you that wants to know, is there more? It's the forbidden question not because you aren't allowed to ask it, but because it forces you to confront the very nature of who you are. If you are eternal, then the smallness of everyday fears loses its grip. If your consciousness continues, then even death is not an ending but a transition. If you exist beyond the body, then you are far more powerful than you've ever been told. This is the truth that terrified scientists and governments alike. The realization that you cannot be reduced to matter, that your awareness is not bound by flesh. If that truth became common knowledge, it would mean that every human being has access to a reality larger than any system, any law, any authority. And once that truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. So let me ask you again, is there life after death? You may not yet know the answer, but you feel the weight of the question pressing on you. It is the one question that levels kings and beggars, leaders and followers, scientists and seekers alike. And as we move deeper into this story, into the hidden testimonies and forbidden research, you will see why this question shook the Soviet Union to its core, and why it still echoes today in your own heart. Because the forbidden question is not just about what happens when you die, it is about who you truly are while you live. What if I told you that the deepest truths about life after death were not hidden in temples or scriptures, but inside cold, locked rooms, guarded by the KGB? Imagine walking down a dim corridor in a Soviet archive. Steel doors, no windows, silence that feels almost alive. Behind those doors were not just files. They were testimonies, photographs, recordings, and reports of things that science could not explain, and the government could not allow you to know. In the language of official documents, it was called the study of anomalous contact situations. In simple words, these were experiments with the soul. The Soviet Union prided itself on being the champion of rationality, of materialism, of facts that could be weighed and measured. Religion was discouraged, spirituality dismissed, and life after death treated as a fairy tale for the weak-minded. Yet, behind the walls of secrecy, something else was unfolding. People who had died and returned were describing things so extraordinary that even hardened scientists had to listen. The state could not publicly embrace such findings. Doing so would unravel decades of propaganda built on the belief that the physical world was all there was, so they created a cover. Outwardly, it was anomalous contact research. Inwardly, it was an exploration of what happens when a human being crosses the threshold of death. Why was it kept locked away? Think about it. If you were told from childhood that the state is your authority, that your life is only the sum of your labor and obedience, how would you react if suddenly you learned that you are eternal, that your consciousness survives the grave, that no earthly power can control what you truly are? Knowledge like this would have been more explosive than any political uprising, more destabilizing than any revolution. It would mean that every citizen, every worker, every soldier was more than the role assigned to them. It would mean the Soviet Union did not own you. The KGB knew this. That is why these archives were sealed, stamped, and hidden in layers of secrecy. The files were filled with stories of tunnels of light, of encounters with loved ones, of voices that spoke from beyond. Some were peaceful, overflowing with love and serenity. Others were dark and terrifying, suggesting that not all crossings are gentle. To allow such stories into the public consciousness would be to admit that the soul exists. And if the soul exists, then what else have they lied to you about? What else has been hidden under the veil of state authority? That kind of questioning could undo the worldview of millions in an instant. This is where the tension lies. On one hand, scientists and doctors were documenting cases that could not be ignored. Patients clinically dead for minutes returned with detailed accounts of what they had seen. Some described entering rooms they had never physically stepped into, recounting conversations that happened while their bodies lay lifeless. Others described floating above their hospital beds, watching doctors work frantically on them, observing every detail with clarity. These testimonies were too consistent, too vivid to dismiss as mere hallucinations. On the other hand, the government could not allow this evidence to circulate. If it became known that consciousness survives the body, then death could no longer be used as a tool of fear. And fear was one of the greatest weapons of control. Think for a moment about how powerful fear of death is. It is the great silencer, the great equalizer. People submit, obey, and conform because of it. But imagine if you truly knew, not just believed, but knew, that death is not an ending. It is a transition. Imagine how differently you would live. Would you still obey blindly? Would you still live small, afraid of punishment, afraid of losing everything? Or would you live with a freedom that no authority could take away from you? This is why the KGB treated these files as dangerous weapons. Knowledge of the soul's survival was more threatening than any political dissent. So they stored it away under layers of classification. Testimonies were taken, written, and stamped, top secret. Photographs were filed. Recordings were locked in metal boxes. Access was restricted to a handful of scientists and officers. For the public, there was silence. But for those who worked inside these projects, there was no silence at all. There was awe. There was fear. There was the sense that they were touching a reality far larger than themselves, a reality that could not be contained by any ideology. The term anomalous contact situations was chosen carefully. It was vague, clinical, sterile. It gave no hint of the depth of what was really being studied. That was intentional. To name it as research on the soul, on life after death, on consciousness beyond the body, would have been too bold. But those involved knew the truth. They were not just measuring brainwaves or cataloging hallucinations. They were listening to voices from the edge of death, voices that described what waits for every human being. The deeper you think about it, the more you realize why this had to be hidden. A government can regulate what you read, what you watch, what you say. It can even punish your body. But it cannot touch your soul. If you awaken to the truth of your eternal nature, you step outside their reach. You become uncontrollable. You become dangerous to systems that depend on obedience. That is why these archives were buried in silence. Now, place yourself in the position of one of those scientists. You've dedicated your life to materialist science, to the belief that everything can be explained through biology and chemistry. Suddenly, you are sitting across from someone who was clinically dead for 5 minutes, and they describe leaving their body, traveling through a tunnel, meeting a presence of indescribable love, and being told it was not their time. Then they return to life, with that memory etched into them forever. Do you dismiss it as imagination? Or do you secretly begin to question everything you've been taught? This is what the KGB feared most, the ripple effect of doubt. One testimony could awaken one scientist could awaken a circle of colleagues, one circle could awaken the masses, and once the masses awaken, control collapses. You live in a world where information is everywhere, but even now, certain truths are still hidden, still dismissed, still labeled as fantasy. Ask yourself, if governments in the past locked away evidence of life after death, what makes you think all the truth is revealed to you now? How much has been buried, sealed, and disguised under sterile names, just like anomalous contact situations? The archives remain a testament to this hidden war, a war not fought with guns or tanks, but with information, a war to decide what you are allowed to believe about yourself, because if you believe you are only a body, then you live in fear. But if you know you are eternal, then no system can control you. This was the secret the KGB fought to bury. This was the knowledge so powerful that it could undo the worldview of millions. And yet, despite all their efforts, whispers escaped. Testimonies surfaced. A photograph here, a leaked report there, a survivor's story told in secret. You are hearing about it now, because truth cannot be chained forever. The forbidden knowledge of those archives still calls to you, urging you to question, to look beyond the veil, to realize that you are more than what you have been told. So ask yourself, what would it mean for you if you knew without a doubt that your consciousness continues beyond death? Would you still live in fear, or would you finally live free? That is the question hidden inside those archives. The question they tried to keep from you. The question that still waits, whispering through the silence. What if I told you that in the heart of the Soviet Union, experiments were being conducted not on weapons, not on machinery, but on the soul itself? Hidden behind locked doors and sterile reports, scientists and operatives entered a realm that no official doctrine allowed them to admit even existed. This was not folklore whispered in villages. This was data collected, recorded, and sealed in archives, under the cold title of Case Number 42. To the outside world, it was just another file in a cabinet. To those inside, it was a forbidden map of human existence beyond the body. The methodology was cloaked in the language of science, but at its core it touched mysteries that had been spoken of by mystics for thousands of years. Survivors of near-death experiences became the subjects, ordinary men and women who had died on hospital tables and returned, carrying memories of tunnels, lights, and presences they could not explain. They were questioned, observed, and sometimes hypnotized to draw out details that the conscious mind resisted. Scientists brought in energy equipment, primitive by today's standards but groundbreaking for its time. Devices meant to detect subtle changes, fields, or emissions around the body during these experiences. Each session produced notes that seemed less like clinical transcripts and more like fragments of an ancient scripture disguised as scientific data. Think of the strangeness of it. In a government that officially dismissed spirituality as superstition, researchers were measuring the departure of the soul. Electrodes were placed on dying patients. Sensors designed to register fluctuations of energy were calibrated to capture the moment life slipped away. When survivors awoke, they were carefully guided through their recollections, sometimes coaxed deeper under hypnosis to peel back layers of memory. What emerged was astonishing in its consistency. Tunnels stretching endlessly, radiant light that felt alive, voices of departed relatives, overwhelming sensations of peace, but also darker landscapes, realms of shadow, cries, and fear that few dared to describe. Priima and his colleagues understood that these experiences could not be reduced to brain activity alone. The reports described perceptions of events that happened while the body was clinically dead. Patients described doctors' conversations in the operating room, details of surgical procedures they could not have seen, the exact placement of instruments, and even the expressions of staff. In other cases, people claimed to travel far beyond the walls of the hospital, witnessing scenes with such accuracy that investigators could later verify them. These were not hallucinations. They were windows into something larger. This is why the research took on the codename Case Number 42. It sounded innocuous, even meaningless, but inside that number was a vault of evidence that threatened to tear apart the materialist worldview. 42 became a whisper among the few who knew, a symbol of the place where science and the unseen collided. Every testimony, every measurement, every blurred photograph of strange lights hovering near bodies was placed into this secret collection. If revealed, it would have been enough to ignite debates that no regime could control. So it remained buried, stamped with secrecy, guarded as if it were more dangerous than nuclear secrets. You can imagine the atmosphere inside those rooms. A patient lies still, their breathing shallow, their body monitored by machines. Electrodes hum softly. Scientists wait, tense, as if standing at the doorway of another world. Then the heart stops. A moment of silence heavier than any sound. Instruments flicker, recording subtle anomalies that no one can quite explain. Minutes pass. Suddenly, a gasp, a pulse. The body revives. Eyes open, and in that moment, another report is born. The patient whispers of floating above the bed, of feeling weightless, of seeing their body below as if it were a discarded garment. The researchers, hardened by years of skepticism, exchange uneasy glances. Another entry for Case Number 42. There is something eerie about trying to capture the soul with wires and machines. It is like attempting to measure a sunrise with a ruler. Yet that was the paradox of these experiments. Science demanded data, But what they were touching could not be fully contained in numbers. The testimonies spoke of realms where time dissolved, where space expanded, where thought itself shaped reality. No chart could capture that. And yet, page after page of reports tried. This was where mysticism and science collided. On one side, you had physicists and doctors trained to believe only in what could be measured. On the other, you had patients returning from the brink describing landscapes of eternity. The collision produced tension that could not be resolved. Some researchers dismissed it as anomaly. Others, including Priima, realized they were witnessing evidence of a truth long spoken in whispers. Consciousness was not confined to the body. Something survived. Consider how daring it was to even admit this possibility within the Soviet system. To suggest that the soul exists was to challenge everything the state built its identity upon. Yet here were doctors, scientists, and operatives carefully cataloguing evidence of that very truth. They could not speak of it publicly, so they spoke of anomalous contact situations. They could not use words like spirit, so they spoke of energy doubles and luminous bodies. But beneath the language of caution lay the same conclusion: death was not the end. And so, case number 42 grew. It contained transcripts of hypnosis sessions, where survivors described moving through tunnels of light, meeting beings they could not name, feeling love so vast it erased all fear. It contained data from machines that recorded inexplicable surges of energy at the moment of death. It contained photographs, blurred and grainy, that some claimed showed shapes leaving the body. For some, it was mystification, for others, it was proof. For all, it was dangerous knowledge that could not be released. Imagine for a moment that you are sitting with one of those survivors. Their body trembles as they recall what they saw. Their eyes widen as they describe light that felt more real than anything on earth. Their voice breaks when they mention being told it was not yet their time, that they must return. As they speak, you feel the truth in their words, a resonance that bypasses logic and reaches directly into your own soul. This is what Priima and his team faced again and again. Each testimony was not only data, it was a revelation. But how could such revelations be contained? How could they be locked in a file labeled Case Number 42, hidden from the world? That is the tragedy of this story. Knowledge so profound that it could free millions was instead sealed away out of fear. Fear that people who knew they were eternal could no longer be controlled. Fear that a population who realized death is not an end would no longer bow to threats. Fear that truth itself could undo the carefully constructed illusion of power. And yet, even within secrecy, truth has a way of whispering. The very fact that you are hearing about case number 42 now is proof of that. The archives may have been locked, but fragments escaped. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into testimonies, testimonies into stories that traveled beyond borders. The collision of science and mysticism could not be buried forever, because it is a collision that lives inside every human being. You too have wondered what happens when you die. You too have felt moments where the veil seems thin, where you sense there is more. Case number 42 was never just about the Soviet Union. It was about you, about the reality that your consciousness is not limited to your body, that you are not a prisoner of flesh, that the mystery of life and death is deeper than any government dared to admit. The classified experiments may have been stamped with secrecy, but the truth they revealed cannot be contained. And as you hear this now, you are part of the continuation of that experiment, part of the great unfolding of knowledge that was once hidden behind steel doors. Because in the end, no file, no code name, no archive can silence what you already feel deep inside, that you are more than your body, and that death is not the end. What if I told you that the most extraordinary evidence for life after death does not come from philosophers or preachers, but from ordinary people who crossed the boundary of death and returned? Imagine lying in a hospital bed, your heart stopped, your body cold, machines flatlining as doctors struggle to revive you. In that space where life seems to end, something else begins. Again and again, those who survive such moments return with stories that defy logic but carry a resonance so deep you feel their truth in your bones. These are the voices from the edge, and their testimonies are more powerful than any theory, more haunting than any myth, because they are spoken by people who have actually been there. One survivor described slipping away from her body as if she were shrugging off a heavy coat. She recalled hovering above the hospital bed, watching doctors move frantically, hearing them call out medical orders. She remembered details that she could not possibly have seen with her eyes closed and her body unresponsive. Later, when she shared what she had witnessed, the staff froze, because her descriptions were precise, down to the instruments they used and the words they spoke in moments when she was clinically dead. She said that as she floated upward, a tunnel opened before her, not a tunnel of stone or wood, but of light itself, stretching infinitely. At the end of it was a brilliance that seemed alive, a warmth that called her home. Another man, a construction worker who had suffered a sudden heart attack, spoke of being pulled into a space where everything felt more real than life itself. He said colors vibrated with intensity, sounds carried meaning beyond words, and every thought manifested instantly. In that place, he encountered his mother who had died years earlier. She did not speak with her lips, but with presence. He understood her perfectly, without a sound. She told him it was not his time, that he had to go back, and though he begged to stay, he felt himself dragged back into his body with a heaviness that was almost unbearable. When he awoke, his chest burned, his ribs ached from resuscitation, but his eyes carried the memory of the light that had embraced him. These stories were not isolated. Again and again, survivors spoke of tunnels, radiant lights, encounters with relatives who had long passed away. They described feelings of peace so profound that no earthly joy could compare, a love so vast that it erased every fear. Some said they saw landscapes beyond comprehension, fields more vivid than any on earth, skies alive with colors that do not exist in the human spectrum. They said time dissolved. They were in eternity where everything was now. To hear them speak was to feel the veil between worlds thinning, as if their words carried traces of that other realm into this one. But not every voice spoke of peace. Some whispered of darker journeys, of visions they tried to bury as soon as they returned. A woman who nearly drowned told of entering a place of confusion and despair. Instead of light, she found herself in a grey fog, surrounded by whispers of lost souls who seemed trapped, searching for something they could not find. She felt fear grip her until a force pulled her upward toward a distant brightness. Later, she struggled to speak of it, ashamed, as if her experience reflected something unworthy within her. Another man, revived after a car accident, recalled being dragged into a chasm where shadows clawed at him. He said he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, as though every lie, every selfish act, every cruelty he had ever committed came rushing back to confront him. The darkness seemed alive, reflecting the parts of himself he had tried to hide. Just when he thought he would be consumed, a voice thundered in his mind, telling him he still had work to do, and suddenly he was back in his body, gasping for air. He refused to speak about it for years, fearful of ridicule, fearful of admitting he had glimpsed something that resembled hell. These darker testimonies were often left out of public reports, but they existed in the archives, tucked away among the more hopeful accounts. They revealed a sobering truth, that what awaits on the other side is not uniform. Some encounter light and peace, others face shadows and regret. Perhaps the afterlife reflects not only an eternal realm, but also the state of one's own soul, the accumulation of choices, the echoes of intentions carried beyond the body. Survivors themselves struggled to explain this. They often said the experience felt like a mirror, showing them the essence of who they truly were. For the scientists who documented these testimonies, the consistency was startling. People of different backgrounds, ages, and beliefs described the same tunnels, the same lights, the same encounters. They were not quoting from books, not repeating folklore. They were recounting personal journeys taken in the moments when life had slipped away. This consistency defied the idea of hallucination, because hallucinations are chaotic, random, and fragmented, while these visions were structured, coherent, and astonishingly similar across cultures. It was as if all of them had tapped into the same reality, a reality hidden until the boundary of death opened the doorway. Yet what haunted the researchers most were not just the reports of peace and beauty, but the way survivors described their reluctance to return. Many said that being pulled back into their bodies felt like a punishment, like being shoved into a cage after tasting freedom. They cried upon waking, not from joy but from loss, mourning the place of light they had been forced to leave behind. This sorrow was often misunderstood by doctors, but in their testimonies it was clear. They had glimpsed their true home, and compared to that, earthly life seemed dim and heavy. Still, despite their sorrow, many also carried back a new sense of purpose. They spoke of being given a mission, though the details varied. Some felt called to be kinder, to serve others, to live with greater compassion. Others felt an urgency to share their story, to tell the world that death is not the end. Even those who had seen darker visions often emerged transformed, determined to change their lives, to heal relationships, to seek forgiveness. The experiences were not just visions, they were catalysts that altered the course of entire lives. Imagine listening to one of these survivors late at night, their voice trembling as they describe the indescribable. You feel the sincerity in their words, the struggle to capture something that language can barely hold. You see the tears in their eyes when they speak of love so vast, it seemed to dissolve their very being. You hear the fear in their tone when they whisper of shadows and despair. These are not stories crafted for attention, they are confessions, attempts to put into human words what lies beyond human experience. And so the voices from the edge continue to call. They tell you that death is not an end, but a passage. They tell you that there is light waiting, but also that there are realms of shadow shaped by the life you have lived. They tell you that you are more than your body, more than your mind, more than the fleeting years you spend on earth. They remind you that when the time comes, you will step into a reality more vivid, more profound, and more final than anything you have ever known here. But perhaps the most important message hidden in these voices is not about what happens after death, but about how you live now. Because every choice, every act of kindness, every betrayal, every moment of love or fear, becomes part of the tapestry you carry into that tunnel, that light, or that shadow. The voices from the edge are not simply describing another world, they are warning you, guiding you, urging you to live with the awareness that your life is not confined to this world alone. So when you hear them, when you let their stories seep into your heart, you cannot help but feel the pull of eternity. You cannot help but ask yourself, when the time comes, what will you see? The light that embraces, or the shadow that confronts? The answer is written not in the future, but in the way you are living right now. What if I told you that when you die, something more than just your heartbeat stops, something leaves you, detaches, and continues on? This was Alexei Priima's most startling claim, one that he built carefully through years of collecting testimonies and watching the evidence pile up in silence. He called it the bioenergetic double, a second body made not of flesh and bone but of light, of energy, of essence. It was this double, he said, that slipped away in the moments of death, hovering for a time before traveling into dimensions unknown. While the physical body lay cold and still, the bioenergetic double awakened, revealing that a human being is never just a body but always something more. Priima described this double as if it were a kind of suit worn by the soul. The physical body was temporary, subject to decay, fragile and finite. But the double was luminous, subtle, free from the weight of matter. Patients who experienced near death often described it in their own words. They said they floated above their hospital beds, watching the scene below with perfect clarity, feeling lighter than air, unbound by gravity. Some even described looking down at themselves with pity, as though the shell they had once identified with was nothing more than clothing now discarded. Priima noticed how consistent these reports were, regardless of age, culture, or belief. He began to see them not as illusions, but as glimpses of a universal truth, that at the moment of death, a separation occurs. The astral body, as some traditions call it, is not a new idea. For centuries, mystics and esoteric teachers have spoken of layers of being, a physical body for living in the material world, and a subtle body for traveling in the unseen realms. Ancient Egyptians portrayed this in their art and sacred texts. They believed that at the moment of death, a bird with a human head, known as the Ba, would rise from the body, carrying the soul into the afterlife. This was not metaphor for them. It was a literal truth about the continuation of consciousness. Their burial rituals, their architecture, even their hieroglyphs, reflected the understanding that human life extends beyond the flesh. Other esoteric traditions echoed the same truth. In Indian philosophy, the concept of the subtle body has been central for thousands of years, with the belief that the soul sheds the physical form but continues to exist in an energetic body capable of traveling across dimensions. In mystical Christianity, there were teachings about the glorified body, radiant and immortal, waiting beyond death. In shamanic practices across cultures, the soul was seen as capable of leaving the body during altered states, traveling to spirit realms, and returning with wisdom. Again and again, in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, the same picture appeared. The human being is not confined to the physical. Something always detaches, something always survives. Priima, being a physicist, avoided religious terms. He spoke in the language of energy. To him, the bioenergetic double was like a field that interpenetrated the body, sustaining it during life. At death, when the body could no longer hold it, this field released, separating and continuing on its own path. He compared it to electricity, invisible yet undeniable, animating machines as long as the current flows. When the machine breaks, the current does not cease to exist, it simply moves elsewhere. In the same way, the body is a vessel. The soul's energy is the current. When the vessel fails, the current flows on. Those who experienced this separation often spoke of how natural it felt. They did not describe panic when leaving their bodies, but rather relief. They felt free of pain, free of heaviness, free of limits. Some said they could pass through walls, move instantly from one place to another, or even perceive thoughts not their own. These accounts fascinated Priima because they hinted that the astral body was not just a passive observer but an active form of consciousness, able to move, perceive, and interact. It suggested that awareness itself was not bound to matter but carried forward in a form of its own. The implications of this were staggering. If every person carries within them a double that survives death, then the idea of mortality changes forever. Death is not destruction, it is division. The physical body returns to the earth, but the bioenergetic double carries on, perhaps to be reborn, perhaps to travel to another realm, perhaps to merge with something larger. This was knowledge that could empower people to live without fear, but it was also knowledge that terrified those in power. Because if you know you are not just a body, you cannot be controlled by threats to the body. Priima's archives included not only testimonies of near-death survivors, but also references to ancient traditions that confirmed what modern science was uncovering. The Egyptians, the Hindus, the shamans, all had already spoken of the astral body. What science was now documenting with electrodes and clinical observations was simply a rediscovery of what mystics had always known. This collision of science and mysticism created both wonder and danger. Wonder, because it confirmed the continuity of human existence. Danger, because it shattered the foundation of a purely material worldview. You can imagine the effect this realization might have on someone hearing it for the first time. To think that your body is not the end, that inside you lives a double waiting to be released, changes everything about how you live. Suddenly, every choice matters in a different way, because you are no longer living just for a few decades but for eternity. Suddenly, the fear of death loses its grip, because death is not annihilation but transformation. Suddenly, the world itself feels less solid, because you begin to understand that reality is layered, that what you see with your eyes is only one dimension of a much greater whole. Survivors often struggled to describe the moment of separation. They spoke of vibrations, of sounds like rushing winds, of a sudden shift in perspective. Some said they felt pulled upward by a force they could not resist. Others said they simply willed themselves to move, and instantly found themselves somewhere else. In every case, the separation revealed to them that they were more than their bodies. And once you know that, you cannot return to your old way of seeing yourself. This is the gift and the burden of the astral separation. It reveals to you your immortality, but it also confronts you with the truth that you are responsible for what you carry into eternity. The double does not leave empty-handed. It carries your essence, your choices, your consciousness. That is why ancient traditions emphasized purity, intention, and alignment. They knew that what leaves the body at death is shaped by the life lived within it. Prima's claim was bold, but it was not isolated. He simply joined his voice to the chorus that had echoed across time, from the hieroglyphs on tomb walls to the chants of shamans to the whispered testimonies of patients who returned from death. All said the same thing: you are more than flesh, you are more than blood, you are a being of light carrying a double that survives. So as you hear this now, you are invited to imagine your own separation. Imagine the moment when your breath stills and your body lies quiet. Imagine feeling yourself rise, light and free, looking down at what you once called you. Imagine realizing that you are not gone, but more alive than ever, filled with awareness, able to move without limit. This is not fantasy, it is testimony, ancient and modern, consistent and undeniable. And it is the truth that Alexei Priima risked everything to put into words. The astral separation is not an ending, it is the beginning of seeing yourself as you truly are. You are not bound to the earth. You are not confined by your skin. You are not reduced to the years between birth and death. You are the traveler, the double, the eternal essence that no grave can contain, and when the time comes, you too will rise, just as those before you have risen, just as the Egyptians carved into stone, just as the survivors whispered from their hospital beds. So the question is not whether you will separate. The question is, are you ready? Are you living in a way that prepares the double to rise into light, or will it sink into shadow? The answer lies not in tomorrow, but in every choice you make today. Because death does not end you, it reveals you. And the astral separation is simply the unveiling of the truth you carry inside. What if I told you that in 1992, in a dimly lit hospital room, a photograph was taken that shook the very foundation of science and belief, a picture so strange, so otherworldly, that even hardened skeptics struggled to explain it away. The image was simple on the surface: a dying patient lying on a bed, monitored by machines, surrounded by sterile instruments. Yet above the body, faint but unmistakable, hovered a luminous shape. It looked like a mist, but it seemed to glow from within. Some described it as a cloud of light, others as a human silhouette made of energy. For those who saw it, the conclusion was immediate: they had captured the soul leaving the body. The photograph quickly became part of the sealed archives, stored under lock and key, along with testimonies and classified notes. To Priima and his team, it was confirmation of what survivors had been saying for years, that something does indeed separate from the body at death. The machines around the patient recorded nothing unusual beyond the cessation of vital signs, but the camera revealed what no instrument could. The image was haunting, not just because of what it showed, but because of what it implied. If this was real, then death was not silence, it was transition. Some scientists who saw the photograph were struck speechless. Here was evidence that aligned with centuries of spiritual tradition, from the Egyptian bowerbird to the descriptions of near-death survivors who spoke of rising out of their bodies. It was no longer just testimony or myth, it was something visible, something tangible, something captured on film. For believers, it was proof, a moment where the invisible became visible. They looked at the image and felt awe, as though gazing into a mystery that could no longer be denied. But others dismissed it as fraud. They argued that the light was an artifact of the camera, a trick of exposure, a reflection from equipment. Some said it was dust on the lens. Others claimed it was a double exposure created by mistake. Skeptics insisted that the human mind sees patterns where none exist, interpreting a blur as a soul because that is what we want to see. For them, the photograph was not evidence of eternity, but proof of human gullibility. The debate grew heated among those few who had access to the file. On one side stood those who believed the image was historic, a glimpse into the survival of consciousness. On the other side stood those who mocked it as pseudoscience. Priima himself remained measured, careful with his words. He knew how dangerous it was to speak too openly. Yet in private, he admitted that the photograph haunted him. It matched too perfectly with the testimonies he had collected. Survivors had spoken of rising above their bodies, hovering for a time, then moving into light. Now, here was a visible form of that very moment, frozen in a single frame. The haunting mystery of the photograph was not just whether it was real or fake, it was why it was hidden. If it was fraud, Why not dismiss it openly? Why seal it away, guard it, and stamp it with secrecy? Why bury it among reports never meant to be seen by the public? The very act of hiding it suggested that it carried weight, that the authorities feared its impact. A simple trick of light does not undo a world view, but the possibility of evidence that the soul survives does, and that was the danger. Imagine if the photograph had been released openly in 1992, when the Soviet system was already unraveling and people were searching for truth. Imagine the conversations that would have spread through the streets. Imagine the hope it might have given to those who had lost loved ones. Imagine the challenge it would have posed to the materialist narrative that had ruled for decades. One image could have sparked a revolution of belief. One image could have opened the door to questions that no government was prepared to answer. That is why it remained buried. For those who encountered the photograph in secret, it carried an unsettling power. Some felt peace when they looked at it, comforted by the thought that their loved ones continued on. Others felt unease, disturbed by the notion that death was not an escape into nothingness, but a continuation into something unknown. The image itself became a mirror, reflecting the beliefs and fears of those who saw it. Proof to some, fraud to others, but always charged with meaning. It is easy to dismiss such things as illusions, yet consider this. Why does the idea of the soul captured on camera stir something so deep inside you? Why does the thought of light rising from a body feel both frightening and hopeful? Perhaps because part of you already knows that it is true. Perhaps because the photograph simply revealed what you have always suspected, that you are more than flesh. The haunting quality of the evidence lies in its ambiguity. If it had been sharper, clearer, undeniable, it would have been easier to accept or reject, but its very blurriness forces you to wrestle with your own belief. You look at it and wonder, is this the soul, or is this a trick of light? The answer depends not only on the image, but on you. The photograph is not just evidence, it is a test. Priima once remarked in private conversations that the photograph was less important as proof than as symbol. Proof can be dismissed or debated, but symbols awaken something beyond logic. The image of a luminous double rising from the body carries an archetypal power that bypasses the intellect. It stirs something ancient, something primal. It resonates with myths told for thousands of years, myths that described in symbolic language what a camera had now hinted at in physical form. The Egyptians carved it into stone, the Hindus described it in their scriptures, shamans spoke of it in their journeys. And in 1992, a Soviet camera clicked, and for a moment, the ancient truth emerged in modern form. Whether you believe the photograph was genuine or not, you cannot deny its effect. Even now, hearing of it, you feel the tension it creates. If it was real, then your life is not confined to your body. If it was fake, then why does the idea of it still haunt you? Why does the possibility stir your imagination, make your heart race, and pull you into wonder? That is the power of forbidden evidence. It does not need to be proven to change you, it only needs to be considered. The archives may have locked away the photograph, but they could not lock away the questions it raised. And those questions are now in your hands. Do you dismiss it as fraud, aligning yourself with the skeptics who find comfort in denial? Or do you allow yourself to see it as a glimpse of the eternal, a moment when the invisible became visible? The choice is yours, but the photograph remains haunting and silent, a reminder that some truths cannot be buried forever. Because, in the end, whether the image was proof or illusion, the deeper truth remains. You are more than your body. Something within you will rise when the body falls. And perhaps, just perhaps, if someone is watching, if a camera is near, they might capture a faint shimmer of your soul as it slips into the light. What if I told you that some people who brushed against death returned with stories not only of tunnels and light, but of voices? Voices that belonged to those they once loved, voices that had no business speaking in a world where the body had already been buried? Imagine closing your eyes on an operating table, believing your last breath had left you, only to find yourself face to face with a parent who passed away years ago, or a child lost too soon, or a friend you thought you would never see again. These encounters were not vague impressions. They were vivid, detailed, often filled with words of comfort or warnings that seemed to carry weight far beyond imagination. They were the kinds of encounters that shook survivors to their core, convincing them that the dead are never truly silent. One woman described drifting out of her body during cardiac arrest. As she hovered, she was enveloped in light, and then she saw her grandmother standing in front of her. Her grandmother looked younger, radiant, filled with life, but her eyes carried the same warmth she remembered from childhood. She did not speak in the way we understand speech. Instead, the woman said, her thoughts poured directly into her, complete and whole, as if meaning itself had been transmitted without the need for words. She was told it was not her time, that she still had things to do, and though she begged to stay, she felt herself pulled back into her body. Later, she confessed that the experience left her both comforted and unsettled, because she knew with certainty that her grandmother continued to exist, and yet she could not speak of it openly without risking ridicule. Another survivor, a soldier who nearly died from injuries on the battlefield, reported seeing comrades who had fallen in combat years before. They stood together, waiting for him in silence. He felt their presence as solid as stone, yet when he tried to ask them questions, their responses came not as sentences but as impressions, symbols, flashes of understanding that entered his mind in a way he could barely describe. He understood they were at peace, that they had moved beyond suffering, but there was also something strange in their communication. It was limited, as if bound by laws he could not comprehend. This is where the phrase emerged in the archives. The dead are forbidden to answer. Survivors often said that their loved ones seemed to hold back, as if an unseen rule prevented them from revealing too much. They offered comfort, sometimes guidance, but never answers to the great mysteries. No one was told what exactly lies beyond the tunnel. No one was given precise descriptions of what awaits after the light. Instead, messages came wrapped in riddles, encoded in feelings rather than facts, leaving the living with both awe and frustration. It was as if the boundary between worlds was guarded by silence, as though truth could only be hinted at but never fully spoken. Priima and his team took these testimonies seriously. They noticed the pattern. Nearly every account of meeting the dead involved communication that was indirect, symbolic, or restricted. Survivors would say things like, "I knew what they meant, but they never said it," or "I felt the message, but no words were spoken." Some received visions instead of explanations. A loved one holding out a hand, a door that could not yet be opened, a light that turned them away. These images seemed to act like coded transmissions, carrying meaning but never full disclosure. Why would this be? Perhaps, Priima speculated, consciousness in that dimension operates differently, with thoughts themselves serving as language. Perhaps also, there are laws of separation, boundaries that prevent the living from knowing too much before their time. To reveal the full structure of the afterlife might alter the course of the living in ways that are not allowed, so the dead speak in symbols, in feelings, in glimpses, offering just enough to assure you they exist, but never enough to erase the mystery of what lies beyond. One particularly haunting testimony came from a man who drowned but was resuscitated after several minutes underwater. He said he found himself walking along a riverbank in perfect stillness, when suddenly his brother, who had died in childhood, appeared before him. His brother smiled, reached out, and touched his shoulder. In that touch was an ocean of meaning, forgiveness, love, and an unspoken message that he would understand only later. When the man awoke in the hospital, he could not articulate what his brother had said, because no words were exchanged, and yet, the message had altered him. He lived the rest of his life with a newfound sense of purpose, convinced that his brother's silence was not emptiness but a language deeper than speech. The strange law of silence gave these encounters an aura of both intimacy and frustration. Survivors often said they wanted to ask questions. What is death really like? Where do we go? Why do some suffer, and others find peace? But the answers never came directly. Instead, they were given impressions, that they had more work to do, that love was the foundation of all existence, that nothing is truly lost. For some, this silence was comforting, because it assured them that life continued without handing them all the answers at once. For others, it was maddening, because they had brushed against the ultimate truth, but could not bring it back intact. Some testimonies felt like coded transmissions from another dimension, fragments of a language designed not to inform, but to awaken. A woman described being shown a vast book filled with light, but when she tried to read it, the pages vanished. The image stayed with her for years, inspiring her to search for wisdom in every form she could find. A man said he was shown a garden where everything pulsed with life, but when he reached for the fruit on the trees, it dissolved in his hand. He understood that he was not yet meant to consume it, that the vision itself was a message, not the fruit. These symbolic encounters were like parables, offering guidance without explanation, awakening without certainty. You can feel the weight of this law even now. The dead may appear, but they do not answer directly. They remind you of love, of purpose, of continuity, but they never hand you the blueprint of eternity. It is as if the universe itself insists that you walk your path without shortcuts, that you grow into truth rather than being handed it complete. The silence of the dead is not cruelty, it is protection. It guards mysteries too vast to be reduced to words, mysteries that must be lived, not told. And yet, within the silence, there is also presence. Survivors who saw their loved ones often said the mere encounter was enough. To see a familiar face glowing with life, to feel their touch, to sense their joy, was more powerful than any explanation. The dead may be forbidden to answer, but their presence speaks louder than words. It tells you that you are not alone, that life continues, that love survives. It whispers through the silence that death is not an ending, but a doorway. The archives recorded these encounters with careful neutrality, but the testimonies themselves carried emotion that no report could contain. Tears stained the words, voices trembled in the recordings, and the silence between sentences often spoke louder than the sentences themselves. Scientists might have called it anecdote, but those who lived it called it truth. So now you are left with the same mystery. When the dead appear, they bring comfort, but not clarity. They speak in silence, in symbols, in coded transmissions that awaken your heart but frustrate your mind. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the silence is the language of the soul, reminding you that some truths cannot be told, only experienced. When your time comes, you too may find yourself standing before someone you thought lost forever. They may smile, embrace you, pour meaning into you without a word. And you may find yourself understanding in an instant what years of searching never revealed, that the silence of the dead is not emptiness, but eternity speaking in its own voice. What if I told you that your life, with all its twists, its triumphs, its heartbreaks, and its mysteries, is not random at all? Imagine for a moment that every step you have taken, every obstacle you have faced, every joy that has ever lifted you, is part of a mission written into the very fabric of your soul. This was Alexei Priima's conviction, a conclusion he reached not only from the testimonies of those who crossed the threshold of death, but from his own deep study of patterns that repeated across cultures, religions, and even in the archives of Soviet research. He believed that every life carries a predetermined purpose, and that no one enters this world without a task to fulfill. Survivors of near-death experiences often returned with words that seemed to echo this belief. Many spoke of being told by luminous beings that their time was not yet over, that they still had work to do, that they had to return because their mission on Earth was incomplete. These survivors were not all mystics or religious seekers. They were ordinary men and women, nurses, workers, soldiers, teachers, who suddenly found themselves in the presence of something greater than themselves. And over again, the same message was whispered into them. You have a purpose. You must continue. It is not yet finished. Priima collected these accounts and noticed their striking consistency. The mission was rarely described in exact detail. Instead, it was conveyed as an inner knowing, a responsibility that unfolded once the person returned to life. Some became healers, others became advocates for compassion. Still others shifted their entire lives toward helping others in ways they had never considered before. It was as if the brush with death stripped away illusions, revealing the blueprint of their soul. To Priima, this was more than coincidence. It was evidence that life is not accidental. He took this idea further. If a mission is given to each soul, then what happens if it is not completed? His conclusion was bold. The soul must return. Reincarnation, a concept often dismissed in Soviet science as superstition, began to appear not as a myth but as a logical necessity. If life is school and missions are lessons, then failure to learn requires repetition. The soul, carrying its unfinished tasks, is drawn back into the world, born again into new circumstances, designed to bring it closer to completion. This belief resonated deeply with research coming from India, where reincarnation was not a fringe idea but a cornerstone of spiritual thought. Priima read accounts of children in Indian villages who spoke of past lives with uncanny detail, remembering names, families, and places they had never visited in their current bodies. Some of these cases had been investigated thoroughly by researchers who verified the children's claims. They could identify former homes, recognize people they had never met, and recall incidents that were later confirmed as fact. To dismiss this as imagination seemed far harder than to accept that the soul truly carries memories across lifetimes. Priima recognized that the Soviet archives and Indian field studies were describing the same phenomenon in different languages. In the hospitals and laboratories, people returning from death said they were sent back because their work was unfinished. In the villages of India, children spoke of returning again and again, carrying fragments of missions not yet complete. Different cultures, different settings, yet both converged on the same truth: the soul does not end, and the soul's mission continues until it is fulfilled. This perspective reframes everything you think you know about your life. If you are here with a mission, then your struggles are not meaningless. They are the exact lessons you came to face. Your failures are not punishments. They are invitations to try again. Your joys are not random gifts. They are reminders of alignment, of moments when you are walking the path you chose before you even arrived. To live with this awareness is to see your life not as chaos, but as curriculum. Survivors who felt this truth deeply often returned with a transformed sense of responsibility. One man, revived after a near-fatal accident, said he was shown scenes from his life, not as judgment, but as review. He saw where he had chosen selfishly, where he had hurt others, and where he had loved. He was told he must return, not because he had failed, but because his mission required more time. When he awoke, he abandoned his former career and dedicated his life to serving the poor, saying that his brush with death had revealed his true calling. Others spoke of returning with heightened intuition, as though part of them remained connected to the dimension they had touched. They felt guided, nudged, or inspired towards certain actions, often without knowing why. Later, they realized those nudges were connected to their mission, subtle reminders of what they had come to accomplish. This invisible guidance aligned with what mystics across the world had always taught: that the soul knows its purpose even when the conscious mind forgets. The idea of unfinished missions also explains why some lives feel strangely heavy, as if burdened by struggles that seem disproportionate. If the soul carries forward unresolved lessons, then those challenges must surface again until they are healed. A person who abused power in one life may return in another to learn humility. A person who withheld love may return to experience the pain of loneliness until they finally open their heart. Far from being punishment, reincarnation becomes education. The universe itself shaping each life as an opportunity for growth. For Priima, this connection between Soviet testimonies and Indian research was undeniable. Though separated by ideology and geography, both pointed toward a spiritual law, that existence is purposeful and continuous. The Soviet state might have ridiculed the idea of reincarnation, but their own classified archives contained evidence that pointed in the same direction. Priima understood that this was knowledge too dangerous for governments, because if people knew they had eternal missions, they could not be controlled by fear of death or conformity to material goals. They would live for something greater. And so, the files remained hidden, while the souls continued their journeys, returning again and again, seeking completion. To you, hearing this now, the message is personal. You are not here by accident. The challenges you face are not meaningless. You are carrying a mission, perhaps one you chose long before you were born, perhaps one you have carried across lifetimes. Every choice you make is part of that mission. Every act of love or fear shapes the path of your soul. Ask yourself, what if the struggles you resist are the very lessons you came here to learn? What if the people who challenge you most are the ones you agreed to meet, to test your growth, to awaken your compassion? What if the feeling of restlessness you sometimes carry is not failure, but the soul reminding you that you still have work to do? The truth whispered in the archives and echoed in Indian villages is the same. The soul does not end with death. It continues until the mission is fulfilled. You are part of that truth. And when your mission is complete, when your soul has learned what it came to learn, you will no longer need to return. You will move into the light not as a student, but as one who has graduated. Until then, every breath you take, every step you walk, every act you choose, is part of your sacred curriculum. The question is not whether you have a mission, the question is, are you living it? What if I told you that one of the most chilling and revealing testimonies to come out of the hidden Soviet archives belonged to a man named Nikolai, whose brush with death became a journey into purgatory itself? His story was not the tale of radiant peace that so many survivors described. It was not a comforting vision of departed loved ones, or a tunnel that led only to light. Instead, it was a journey that stripped him bare, dissolving his sense of self, confronting him with shadows, and forcing him to recognize truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. It was this testimony that Priima held in special regard, because it was not simply another confirmation of survival beyond death. It was a warning, a glimpse into the consequences of how a life is lived. Nikolai had been an ordinary man, a factory worker, respected by his colleagues, known for his quick temper and sharp tongue. He was not a man who thought often of death. He believed in the materialist creed of his society, that when the body dies, nothing remains. Yet, when he collapsed suddenly from cardiac arrest, and was clinically dead for several minutes, his journey proved otherwise. When he was revived, he could not hold back the story of what he had seen, though he spoke with a trembling voice, knowing how impossible it would sound to others. He described the first moment as a sudden tearing, a sensation that he was being pulled upward with great force. His body was left behind on the hospital bed, yet he felt more alive than he ever had in life. He could see doctors working furiously, hear their words, notice every detail of their faces. Then, in an instant, he was drawn into a tunnel. Unlike others who described the tunnel as filled with warm light, Nikolai's tunnel was cold, dark, and narrow, as though he were being funneled through a passage carved out of shadow. He felt as though he were being pulled by an unseen current, rushing faster and faster towards something unknown. As he moved through this tunnel, he began to sense presences around him. They were not visible in any physical sense, yet he could feel them watching. He said it was as if thoughts themselves had grown into forms, crowding around him, whispering, pressing against him. At first, he was terrified, because he felt exposed. Every secret, every regret, every selfish thought he had ever had seemed to be known instantly by these presences. He realized, with horror, that there was no privacy in this realm. Thought itself was naked, and he could hear not only his own but those of others too. When he emerged from the tunnel, he saw a light, but it was not the welcoming brilliance others had spoken of. It was distant, flickering, as though behind a veil. Instead of peace, he felt confusion. The ground beneath him seemed unstable, dissolving and reforming with each step. Walls appeared and vanished. He reached out to touch them, only to pass through them as though they were mist. At first he felt astonished, liberated by this ability to transcend matter. But soon he realized that his surroundings were responding to his own mind. When he felt fear, the walls grew taller and colder. When he longed for comfort, they dissolved into emptiness. It was a purgatory shaped not by external punishments, but by his own state of being. The most frightening part, he confessed, was the loss of identity. In the beginning, he thought of himself as Nikolai, the factory worker, the man with a name and a history. But the longer he stayed, the less those memories seemed to matter. His sense of individuality began to dissolve, as if the boundaries that held him together were thinning. He felt himself slipping into the thoughts around him, blending into a sea of voices, losing the clear line that defined who he was. This terrified him, because it felt like death within death, not just the loss of his body, but the loss of his very self. He cried out in his mind, begging for help, begging for something to hold on to. At that moment, the flickering light grew stronger, piercing through the fog. He said it was not a voice, but a presence that entered him, commanding him to return. The light was not warm in the way others described. It was fierce, almost stern, but it was also the only thing that pulled him out of the confusion. He felt himself being dragged back, faster and faster, until suddenly he slammed into his body, gasping for breath as doctors shouted in relief. When he awoke, his eyes were filled with tears, not only from the pain of revival, but from the memory of what he had seen. He said he had not been judged by some external figure, but he had been judged by himself, by the weight of his own thoughts, by the truths he had tried to hide. In that realm, lies were impossible. Every intention, every action, every shadow in his heart had confronted him. The purgatory he experienced was not a place of fire or torment inflicted from without. It was the mirror of his own soul, projected into a reality where there was no escape from seeing himself fully. Nikolai's testimony disturbed Priima deeply. It was so different from the peaceful accounts of light and love that filled many reports, yet it carried a profound weight, because it revealed that what awaits after death is not the same for everyone. Some encounter peace because they carry peace within. Others encounter confusion because they carry confusion. The afterlife, in this view, is not uniform but shaped by the essence of the soul. For Nikolai, the most unsettling detail was the loss of identity. He said that in life, he had clung fiercely to who he was, his role, his pride, his possessions, his grudges. In purgatory, those attachments dissolved, leaving him exposed. He realized how fragile the self-image he had built really was, how quickly it could disintegrate when stripped of the body. The ability to hear thoughts and pass through walls was astonishing, but it came with the realization that everything around him was impermanent, malleable, shaped by mind alone. There was no solid ground to cling to, no anchors to hold. The only permanence was the truth of his own consciousness, and even that felt fragile in the face of dissolution. When he spoke of this later, his voice trembled. He said that though he had returned to life, he would never be the same. He no longer feared death in the way he once had, but he also no longer took life lightly. He understood that every thought, every action, every choice shapes what you carry into the afterlife. He lived with greater care, more humility, as though purgatory was not just a place beyond death, but a state he could enter even now if he did not live with awareness. Priima regarded Nikolai's account as one of the most important pieces of evidence in the archives, not because it proved survival, but because it revealed the moral dimension of that survival. Life after death was not simply a continuation, it was a confrontation. It showed that consciousness does not dissolve into bliss automatically. It carries its own weight, its own shadows, its own light. And that weight becomes the very landscape of the afterlife. For you, hearing this story now, the question becomes unavoidable. If you were to step through the tunnel today, what would you find? Would you encounter light that welcomes you? Or would you find yourself in a fog of your own unresolved thoughts? Would you rise into peace, or would you dissolve into confusion? Nikolai's story is not just his, it is a reflection of the truth that what you carry inside shapes where you go. This is the haunting power of his testimony. It reminds you that purgatory is not a myth meant to scare children. It is a mirror waiting for every soul, a realm where the illusions of identity fall away and only truth remains. It warns you that the time to prepare is not after death, but now, in every choice, in every intention, in every act of love or cruelty. Because in the end, the walls you face, there are the walls you are building here. Nikolai lived the rest of his life with this awareness, quieter, softer, less quick to anger. He had seen what lay ahead when self-image collapses, and he no longer wished to carry shadows into that place. His testimony remains a reminder, written in the archives, whispered now into your ears, that the afterlife is not distant or abstract. It is the reflection of who you are becoming with every breath. And when the time comes, you too will walk through your tunnel, you too will meet your light, and you too will face the truth of yourself, with no walls left to hide behind. Spirituality, narration said, what if I told you that for every survivor who came back from the edge of death with stories of light and tunnels, there were others who carried their visions in silence, unable or unwilling to share them. The Soviet archives contained hundreds of reports, but for every testimony written down there were countless others lost, because many survivors were too afraid to speak. Their fear was not only of ridicule or disbelief, it was the deeper terror of having seen something so vast, so overwhelming, that to put it into words felt like betraying its truth. For some, the trauma of knowing too much was heavier than death itself. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed, your body aching from resuscitation, doctors congratulating themselves for saving your life, while inside you are trembling with the memory of what you just experienced. You have walked through a tunnel of light, or wandered in a landscape of shadows, or stood before presences that pierced your very being. You have felt stripped of all illusion, exposed in a way no human being can prepare for. And now you are expected to return to normal life, to go back to work, to sit at the dinner table, to talk about trivial things. How do you do that when you have touched eternity? For many, the answer was simple. You do not. You keep silent. Priima noted that survivors often hesitated during interviews, their voices faltering as though they were weighing every word. Some would break down crying before they could finish. Others would stop mid-sentence, shake their heads, and refuse to go on. The scientists recording these sessions often interpreted this as psychological trauma, but Priima suspected it was more than that. He believed the survivors felt an internal prohibition, as if part of them knew that certain truths could not be spoken aloud. They had glimpsed realities that language cannot capture, and to try was not only painful but dangerous. The trauma of knowing too much was not just intellectual, it was existential. Survivors often described feeling alienated after their experiences, as though they no longer belonged fully to the world. They saw their families, their friends, their daily routines, and yet it all felt strangely distant, like watching shadows on a wall, while knowing there was a brighter reality just beyond. Some became depressed, unable to reconcile what they had seen with the life they had returned to. Others became restless, driven by a mission they did not fully understand, haunted by the memory of presences urging them to change. They had crossed a boundary and returned, but a part of them never came back. One woman in the archives refused to speak of her vision for years. She had been declared clinically dead after a drowning accident, revived after 10 minutes without breath. Doctors called it a miracle, but she later confessed it felt more like a punishment. During her near-death state, she had seen a vast expanse of light, but as she moved toward it, she was suddenly shown every moment of cruelty in her life. She watched herself belittle her children, betray her friends, speak words of bitterness to strangers. She felt the pain she had caused others, as if it were her own. When she revived, she could not bear to speak of it. She told Priima later that silence was her only protection, because the memories were too sharp, too humiliating, too unbearable to share. Other survivors refused to speak for fear of ridicule. The Soviet culture of the time was hostile to anything resembling spirituality. To claim you had seen your deceased relatives or spoken to luminous beings was to risk being called insane, or worse, to be suspected of spreading superstition. In a society where materialism was the official creed, to admit such experiences could endanger your career, your reputation, even your safety. Survivors learned quickly that silence was safer than honesty. And so the suppression was not only external, imposed by the state, it was internal, a choice made by individuals who weighed the cost of truth against the need to survive. Priima recognized this double suppression. On one level, the government locked away testimonies, sealed photographs, and stamped files with secrecy. But on another, the survivors themselves became their own jailers, refusing to let their words escape their lips. They were haunted by the feeling that they knew something forbidden, something that set them apart, something they were not allowed to share. Many described feeling marked, as if others could sense they had crossed the threshold. This isolation drove them deeper into silence. The fear of revelation was not only personal, it was cultural. To speak openly about life after death would have been to challenge the foundation of Soviet ideology. Materialism depended on the denial of spirit. If even one survivor stood up and proclaimed that the soul survives, that death is not an end, it would have been an act of defiance. Most were not prepared to bear that weight. Silence was easier, even if it meant carrying the burden alone. But silence has a cost. Survivors who suppressed their experiences often developed illnesses, depression, or a sense of being disconnected from life. They were living with secrets too big for the human heart to contain. Some eventually broke down and told their stories in private, whispering them to trusted friends or family members desperate for release. Others carried their visions to the grave, never allowing another soul to hear what they had seen. The archives are filled with testimonies, but Priima always believed they were only a fraction of what truly existed. The silence of survivors was the greatest archive of all, one that would never be opened. And yet, even in silence, the experiences changed them. Survivors often became gentler, more compassionate, more aware of the fragility of life. They carried a quiet certainty that death is not the end, and though they did not speak it, they lived it. Their silence became its own form of testimony, written not in words but in transformed lives. Those who knew them often said they seemed calmer, as if they were no longer afraid of anything. The trauma of knowing too much weighed on them, but it also gave them a strange strength. For you, hearing this now, the fear of revelation carries its own lesson. There are truths so vast that they resist being spoken. There are experiences that leave you forever changed, unable to return fully to the life you knew before. Perhaps you have felt a fragment of this yourself. Moments when you glimpsed something greater, something you could not explain, and you kept silent because you feared ridicule, or because you could not find the words. You know the weight of silence, the ache of knowing more than you can say. The survivors of near death did not remain silent because they had nothing to share. They remained silent because what they had to share was too great for words, too threatening to systems, too disruptive to the fragile illusion of normal life. Their silence is a mirror, reminding you that some truths are not denied by others, but buried within yourself. The suppression is both external and internal, both imposed and chosen. And the question that lingers is whether you will continue that silence, or whether you will dare to live in a way that reflects the truth you already feel. Because in the end, the fear of revelation is not about governments or archives. It is about you. What would it mean if you spoke your truth? What would it mean if you admitted that you know you are more than a body, more than a name, more than the span of years given to you here? Would you risk the ridicule, the alienation, the burden of knowing too much? Or would you stay silent, carrying it in your heart, letting the world remain blind? The choice is yours, but know this: silence does not erase truth, it only delays its power. Spirituality, narrations said, "What if I told you that the most dangerous secrets ever locked away in the KGB archives had nothing to do with missiles, codes, or espionage, but with the soul itself?" Imagine a vault filled with testimonies, photographs, and reports, not of military maneuvers or political betrayals, but of what happens when a human being crosses into death and returns. These were not simply files. They were a challenge to everything the Soviet Union, and in truth every government, had built its authority upon. That is why the archives were stamped top secret, hidden under layers of silence, sealed away not only from the public, but from most of the scientific community as well. What lay inside was not just data, it was forbidden knowledge, knowledge that could unravel religion, destabilize politics, and transform humanity's understanding of itself. The first reason the archives were sealed was control. If people knew that consciousness survives death, if they realized they were eternal beings who could not be reduced to flesh, then fear of death would lose its grip. And fear of death is one of the most powerful tools of governance. Entire empires have depended on it to maintain obedience. If you are convinced this single life is all you have, you will cling to it at any cost. You will comply, submit, obey. But if you know that you continue, that the body is only a garment you wear for a while, then no earthly power can fully control you. That alone made the knowledge too dangerous to reveal. But there was another, darker reason the archives were hidden. Whispers spread even among the researchers about experiments designed not only to observe natural near-death experiences, but to force them. Rumors told of patients being pushed to the brink deliberately, of techniques used to drive the soul out of the body while instruments recorded what happened. Some spoke of hypnosis taken to extremes, of electrical currents, of chemical inducements that hovered between anesthesia and death. The idea was not only to study what happened spontaneously but to provoke separation, to capture the soul in the act of leaving. Whether all of these rumors were true is impossible to know, but their presence in whispered testimony was enough to chill those who heard them. If the rumors were true, it meant that science had trespassed into a sacred domain, crossing a boundary that traditions across the world had guarded with reverence. Forcing the soul from the body would not be research, it would be violation. Survivors of natural near-death experiences often described being told they must return because their time was not yet complete. To interfere with that timing would be to interfere with destiny itself. Priima and others must have known the danger of tampering with forces that no machine or equation could control. And yet, in the secrecy of a regime obsessed with knowledge and power, the temptation was too strong. The implications of these hidden experiments went far beyond the Soviet Union. If it could be proven, beyond doubt, that the soul exists, then the entire structure of religion would be shaken. Faith depends on mystery, on the promise of something unseen. But if the unseen becomes measurable, if photographs and reports reveal the mechanics of the afterlife, then the authority of priests and sacred texts could crumble. Religion thrives on being the gatekeeper of eternity. Forbidden knowledge threatens to bypass that gate. Imagine millions of people realizing they do not need intermediaries to tell them about heaven or the afterlife, because science itself had captured glimpses of it. That would disrupt not only doctrine, but centuries of power. Politics, too, would be destabilized. Governments claim authority over life and death, over justice and punishment. But if people know that death is not an end, then the threat of punishment loses its edge. Wars waged to protect the living order would be questioned if souls simply continue on. The very foundation of political control rests on the assumption that this world is final, that consequences begin and end here. To reveal otherwise would undermine the state's greatest weapon, fear. That is why these archives, though filled with what appeared to be scientific data, were treated like nuclear secrets. They threatened not weapons, but worldviews. And beyond religion and politics lies the deepest implication of all: human destiny. If the soul exists, if it survives the body, if it carries its essence forward into other realms or other lives, then humanity itself is not what we have been told. We are not fragile creatures limited to a handful of decades. We are eternal travelers in an infinite cosmos. That changes everything about how we live. It means every choice echoes beyond the grave. It means death is not an erasure, but a revelation. It means we are not simply consumers and workers, but souls on a mission far greater than this brief stage of existence. This is the forbidden knowledge that terrified those in power. It was not just about tunnels and lights, not just about out-of-body experiences. It was about the collapse of control, the unraveling of systems built on fear, and the awakening of human beings to their true nature. Once a person realizes they are eternal, they cannot be ruled in the same way. Once they know they will carry the weight of their actions beyond death, they no longer obey blindly. Once they see themselves as souls instead of bodies, they are free in a way no authority can tolerate. And so the archives were sealed, not to protect truth, but to suppress it. Scientists were silenced, survivors were discouraged from speaking, and rumors were buried under the weight of official denial. Yet the truth has a way of leaking through cracks. Whispers spread, testimonies escaped, and even now you are hearing what was never meant for you to hear. That alone proves that forbidden knowledge cannot remain buried forever. Think of the courage it must have taken for Priima to pursue this research. Knowing the risk, he was not simply studying anomalies, he was pulling on a thread that, if unraveled, could dismantle entire empires. He knew the implications, he knew the danger, and yet he continued, because once you glimpse eternity, you cannot return to silence. Now the question becomes personal. What would you do with such knowledge? If you knew without doubt that the soul survives, would you live differently? Would you treat others differently, knowing that the pain you cause becomes your own mirror in purgatory? Would you pursue love more fiercely, knowing it is the only treasure you carry beyond the grave? Or would you bury the truth in yourself, suppressing it out of fear, just as governments buried the archives? The forbidden knowledge of the KGB archives is not just about history, it is about you. It is about the truth that you are more than you believe, that your destiny is larger than this lifetime, that the systems of power around you are far smaller than the soul within you. That is why it was hidden, that is why it was sealed top secret, and that is why, even now, it whispers through the silence, asking you to remember what you have always known, that you are eternal. What if I told you that everything you have heard up until now, the testimonies, the archives, the experiments, the whispers of the forbidden, all of it comes down to a single question that only you can answer? When your time comes and you step through that threshold, what will you see, light or darkness? The stories of survivors reveal both. tunnels filled with warmth and love, and realms of confusion where shadows linger. Which one you encounter will not be random, nor dictated by chance. It will reflect what you carry inside, the choices you have made, the love you have given, the truth you have embraced or denied. That is why this is not just a story about the past or about secret archives. It is a story about you. Think about it for a moment. You are alive right now, breathing, thinking, feeling, but one day, as surely as night follows day, your body will stop. Your heartbeat will falter, your breath will fade, and the physical shell you inhabit will no longer hold you. In that moment, you will rise into the reality beyond. What you meet there will not be foreign, it will be the mirror of your soul. If you have lived with love, you will rise into love. If you have lived with fear, anger, or deception, you will encounter them magnified in forms you cannot escape. This is the most important lesson hidden within the archives. Not that the soul survives, but that the soul carries everything forward. Nothing is lost, nothing is hidden. For personal growth, this knowledge is a gift. Imagine what it means to know that your life is not meaningless, that every choice echoes beyond your final breath. Suddenly, kindness is not just moral behavior, it is an investment in eternity. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is freedom for your soul. Love is not sentimental, it is the very substance of what you will become when your body dissolves. When you live with this awareness, your priorities shift. You stop clinging to what does not matter, and you start nurturing what does. You realize that power, wealth, and status vanish at death, but compassion, truth, and courage stay with you. Spiritual awakening begins when you accept this truth not as a theory but as reality. You awaken when you see that death is not the end of you, but a passage into a realm where the illusions of this world are stripped away. What will be left is who you truly are. If you have worn masks in this life, they will fall. If you have hidden behind lies, they will dissolve. Awakening now means beginning to live as your true self while you are still here, so that when the moment comes, you are not afraid to be revealed. The archives told us that many who returned felt their missions were incomplete. They were sent back because they still had work to do. That is true for you as well. You are here for a reason. It may not be written in a book or explained in detail, but it is written in the way your heart stirs when you feel called towards something greater. Every time you feel a pull to act with love, to create, to heal, to forgive, you are touching your mission. And the greatest tragedy is not death itself, it is leaving this life without having lived your purpose. Ask yourself now, what are you carrying? What are you shaping in your soul? When your body falls away, what will remain? Will you rise into light because you cultivated light within yourself? Or will you stumble into shadow because you allowed fear and bitterness to rule you? These are not abstract questions. They are the most urgent ones you will ever face. Because the afterlife is not just something waiting in the distance, it is being created by you in every moment you live. The call then is simple and profound. Embrace your life's purpose. Do not waste time thinking you are only flesh and bone, destined to vanish. You are a soul, and your life here is a passage, a chapter in a much larger story. When you live with this awareness, everything changes. Your struggles become lessons, your relationships become sacred encounters, your suffering becomes the fire that shapes your spirit. You begin to see that nothing is meaningless, that even the smallest act of kindness can ripple into eternity. Imagine how differently you would live if you knew, beyond doubt, that death is not the end. Would you speak more gently to those you love? Would you forgive faster, hold grudges less tightly? Would you live with more courage, knowing you cannot truly be destroyed? Would you chase truth instead of comfort, purpose instead of distraction? The answer is yes, because when fear of death dissolves, fear of life dissolves with it. You are free to live fully, because you know that nothing can erase you. This is what it means for you, to realize that the forbidden knowledge buried in the archives was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to awaken you, to shake you out of sleep, to remind you that your life is sacred and your soul is eternal. It means that when you face death, you will not be stepping into darkness blind. You will be stepping into a truth you have been preparing for all along. And preparation does not begin on your deathbed. It begins now, in every choice, in every breath. So let me ask you again, directly. When the moment comes, what will you see? light or darkness? That answer is not written in the archives, not dictated by scientists or governments, not sealed in any secret file. It is written in your soul, in how you live, in the love you give, in the courage you show, in the forgiveness you offer. You hold the key. You are writing your afterlife right now, moment by moment. And when the time comes for you to leave this body, you will rise. You will step into the tunnel, you will meet the presences waiting, and you will see yourself as you truly are. Death will not be an end, it will be a passage. And if you live with love, with purpose, with truth, then that passage will not be something to fear, but something to embrace. The greatest secret the KGB archives tried to hide is not about experiments, not about photographs, not about reports. The greatest secret is that you are eternal. That knowledge alone has the power to undo fear, to free you from control, to awaken you to the magnificence of who you truly are. Do not wait for death to reveal it, live it now. Embrace your purpose, and when the moment comes, you will walk into the light with no fear, no regret, only freedom.